Welcome to another episode of Safe Space, the podcast for next gen, rising gen family business leaders. Today we're joined by Dave Specht, based out of Washington. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dave, before we get started, can you let the audience know a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why you're so passionate about it?
Sure. Well, I'm a husband, a father. I have 6 kids, and
Wow. Okay.
I'm a senior fellow at the Drucker School Global Family Business Institute, and my personal mission is to preserve families and perpetuate businesses in that order. And I think that stems from, my own family relationships. The most important thing to me is not my assets, it's my children and the relationships I have with them. And as I work with families, many times we need to remind them that businesses can be rebuilt, financial capital can be found and developed in other ways. But if you don't invest in your relationships, um, those likely will not be rebuilt. So I have a real passion for kind of humanizing the whole process.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I think the industry has focused typically on the financial capital side of things. Like, when we talk about succession and transition, and by the way, when I mention the industry, I'm not just talking about advisors, I'm talking about families as well, right? The focus has been on the how and the what side of things, particularly around the financial capital side of assets. And just now we're starting to pay attention to the human side, right? So let's talk about the rising generation. They've been painted with this brush of entitlement. They've got it easy. They've been misunderstood. They've been judged harshly at times, in my opinion. So let's talk about maybe how we should look at them from a different perspective. You talked about empathy before we started the show. So can you expand on looking at the next generation, the rising gen, from a lens of empathy and what that means and how that could benefit them and the succession?
Well, when I look at the rising gen, I think of a group that is following, a captain of industry, someone that is larger than life character, probably. And the pressure that comes with that, whether that person is an athlete, a business creator, whatever, the standard to which they are held is unreasonable and unrealistic. And so I feel a great deal of empathy for them. Honestly, each of us in our lives has to figure out who we are. And I really think that for the rising gen to work on developing their own identity and finding their purpose is maybe the most important thing that they should do. And if that identity and purpose ends up being connected with the business, the financial capital that your parents or grandparents have accumulated, great. And if not, that's okay too, because ultimately, if the rising generation figures out what is their purpose, what is their interest, what is their curiosity, and then they apply that, they're going to find success. And their parents and grandparents, yes, they may have financial capital, but what they really likely have is relationship capital. So, whatever the rising generation wants to do, parents, grandparents oftentimes have connections to be able to help them to fulfill their dreams and goals through the people that they know, not necessarily just the money that they have. So I think sometimes we need to turn the process on its head, encourage the rising generation to find out what they're interested in, what is their curiosity, and then invest in that curiosity and see what happens.
So how do you talk to a next gen, a rising gen member around uncuffing the shackles of what it means to be of a prominent family and find their own purpose? Because in a lot of the times, they fall into the purpose of the group versus individual purpose. So how do you assist them? How do you talk to them about, let's follow the path of your own personal purpose versus the greater purpose of the group?
Well, when I think about the financial capital, I think sometimes it's helpful for a rising gen to look at the financial capital as just another member of the family that you have to be in
Okay.
relationship with. And so you get to decide what kind of a relationship you want to have with that now humanized financial capital. So you can hate that thing, You can be jealous of it because it gets the attention of your parents. You can choose to be in relationship with it, try to understand it, try to see what it can do for you. So I think that's one, kind of maybe a strange technique, but look at it like it's a new member of the family that you're going to be in relationship with. I mean, you think about trust accounts, and some of these things that get set up for the rising generation. They're essentially setups for you to have a relationship with the financial capital. And so if the rising gen can realize that this is just another entity that's been introduced to the family that you're going to be asked to interact with. And then the rising gen gets the opportunity to interact with it with curiosity or with disdain. And, you know, and I think the main thing for the rising gen is for them to realize that they are agents, that they get to choose. They get to choose how they want to feel about it. They get to choose how to be in relationship with it. They get to choose to accept and fully embrace this member of the family or to reject it. And there's implications for all of it. So I think it may be one helpful way to look at the financial capital.
That's a great way to put it, because one of the things that we talk about with our clients in our practice is our beliefs about money. So our relationship with it, right? The industry tends to focus on the what and the how of money. How do we grow it? How do we transition it? What do we do with it? But rarely do we consider, how do I feel about it? What's my relationship with it like? Do I attract? Do I repel? Am I jealous of it? Do I feel intimidated by it? And I think if we look at it as, the way you put it so eloquently, is a relationship with this entity or this other member of the family, we get to choose what kind of relationship we have with it.
Yeah.
In other words, we get to control it versus it controlling us.
One other thing to be curious about for the Rising Gen listener is for them to examine the relationship that their parents have with that financial capital. And as they observe the relationship their parents have, they may be able to find empathy for their parents in the relationship with financial capital. And where the rising gen can extend empathy towards their parents and why they set up what they did and why they have the relationship with the money that they do, or why they have a scarcity mentality with money, or whatever it may be, if they can be curious enough, then they can be empathetic towards their parents and whatever structures were developed, then that gives them an opportunity to have a positive relationship with that entity or structure as well.
I love the fact that you brought up the empathy for the parents. Because one of the things that's missing in a lot of families and relationships, period, is a lack of empathy. We're quick to judge, we're quick to blame, we're quick to criticize, yet we never take the time to understand why that individual does what they do, right? And once we understand it, we can have empathy and compassion. It doesn't mean we like it or put up with it. We just have an understanding with clear boundaries.
Yep, I agree. And also, I mean, when you look at a parent or a grandparent that has generated great financial capital, especially those that went from having nothing to developing and amassing wealth, their relationship, their identity is so connected to the wealth or to the business that they built that many of them don't know what they would be, who they would be without it. And so some of that is what drives the creation of these structures and strategies for the senior generation to cope with their relationship with this newfound financial capital.
You know, um, the greatest addiction human has is to our identity. We think we are what we do or what we've achieved. And there's a great quote that I read in a book that says, "You will never find yourself in what you've built to define yourself." And I think human beings attach great meaning to what they've created, and that becomes their identity. So, therefore, Rising Gen, as you're listening to this, Dave, you bring up a very strong point here. It's important to have empathy that your parents and grandparents, uncles, aunts, moms, grandmothers want to intellectually let go, but yet there's an emotional attachment to what they've created because they think I am that thing. And if I'm not that thing anymore, where am I and how do I, where's my purpose?
There's also a great myth that goes on typically with the founding generation, that that they built this so that their rising generation, their children and grandchildren, could have a life that they didn't have. And it's tricky because many times what the rising gen wants is time and attention. And that time and attention has largely, in most cases, gone to the business that has been created. And so there's this fine balance between developing financial capital, developing a business, and fostering the relationship with the rising generation. And many times that comes out of balance. And when it becomes out of balance, that lack of balance is many times what creates great financial capital. And so for the senior generation to try to bring it back into balance is very, very challenging. So there, again, I think there needs to be empathy on both sides and patience with each other along the way.
A lot of parents, they want to make up with lost time with the
Mm-hmm.
checkbook,
Yep.
right? They want to gift, they want to give experiences. And what I tell them is, it's the wrong currency. You don't make up lost time with a checkbook, you make up lost time with time. Right? And at the same time, the rising gen should have empathy, or I recommend they have empathy as you do, that their parents sacrificed time with them to accumulate the financial success and the opportunities that success brings them, and to recognize that originally it was to feed the family, right? And as I tell a lot of clients, particularly founders, it's not their intention to accumulate a lot of wealth so that one day that wealth could destroy their family, right? And right, it's never that intention, but that's what happens a lot of times because there's a lack of fundamental empathy for each other and appreciation for each other.
Well, and then we go ahead and introduce tons of complexity, with the structures that get developed, the trusts and other things that people don't understand. And where there is a lack of understanding, that trust is going to erode as well. Well, why did they develop the trust? Why didn't they leave things to me outright? Is it because they didn't trust me, because they didn't love me? So as these structures get developed, there needs to be a story that's told about the why for the structure. And many times I find that the rising generation doesn't understand the why behind the structure that was created for them. And so it feels like something is being done to them rather than something that's being done for them.
Yes, and most of the times, the rising gen have not been included in the conversations around the structures. So there's assumptions on both sides of the table. I assume my kids aren't ready. And by the way, what you'll know this, Dave, is the biggest issue in transition and wealth transfer is not a business issue; it's a parental issue. How do I, as a parent, prepare the children to one day handle the wealth, whatever that may be? But the challenge is when you ask those parents, can you clearly articulate and put it into practical terms what prepared means? They can't define it. So they assume I need to protect the kids because they're not ready.
Yeah. Well, and what we have going on there is we have this issue of simultaneous roles. And where we have simultaneous roles as a business owner, the way that you generated wealth was by taking some risk, by putting something at risk. Well, as a parent, my job is to protect my child. And so we have two different systems and two different measurements of success. And so when you look at the accumulation of financial capital, and then you look at raising a child safely, oftentimes those get confused. And so many times we're protecting our children against understanding the risks that the business takes every day so that they don't have to worry. And so when we've protected them from that, then many times the rising generation doesn't fully understand or feel what the parents felt when it comes to owning and running the business. And so many times they find themselves unequipped and unprepared.
So, in your opinion, why do you think we have such a gap in communication here? Because they seem to be obvious things to talk about, but yet there's a massive, massive gap in communicating from one generation to the next about these issues. Why do you think that is?
So there's a few things going on. One is everyone expects the other person to go first. So the rising generation oftentimes believes that it's really the right and the obligation of the wealth creator or their parent to start the conversation. The wealth creator is waiting for the rising generation to express interest or curiosity about the business or the wealth. And so what happens is there's this great dance where no one's talking about it, but actually both of them want to be in conversation about it. And I've seen this over and over and over again. So who goes first? Who knows? I would say if the rising gen is listening to this, be curious if you want to know. Be curious, not from a greed standpoint, but be curious. And if there's a parent that happens to be listening to this, assume your child wants to know something about the business. They'll tell you if they're not interested. It may not have to be a very long conversation, but I think both are waiting for the other to go first because the senior generation doesn't want to impose their dream on the rising generation, and the rising generation maybe doesn't want to step on toes by asking questions that they may feel are inappropriate. So they're both just waiting for permission to talk.
What I've noticed with families that we serve is every family has a champion, and typically it's a rising gen member. And typically, this person is ostracized or considered the black sheep of the family because they see the future. They see what's coming down the pipe. I think for those of you that are listening, if you're a champion and you're the one thinking about this sort of stuff, Dave has great advice. Go first. Just be, as we say, be playfully curious. Hey, mom, dad, grandpa, uncle, aunt, what are your plans for this thing? What do you want to do about it? Have you thought about it? Like what are your concerns? What are your wishes? What are your fears? Just be open about engaging in the conversation about this thing that you may or may not be in a relationship with.
What I would encourage is for the rising generation to be curious about the parents' journey rather than their things. So I would say if I'm 22 or I'm 23-year-old rising gen, I would probably go to my father or my mother and say, or my grandfather or my grandmother and say, take me back to when you were 23. What were you thinking about when you were 23? What were your worries? What were your dreams? Like I want to know where you were at my age. So I would start with a curiosity about their parents' past, their development, their history, and then ultimately the stuff that is developed along the way. It'll come up in conversation, but I wouldn't lead with the stuff. I would lead with curiosity about their journey.
That's great advice. That's great advice because at the end of the day, we all love stories and we all love telling stories, particularly about ourselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Give us an inch. We'll take a mile.
Because the reality is, human beings are pretty self-centered, where it's all about us, right? And if someone asks us about, hey, tell me about you and your success, we're going to go on.
That's so this is the ultimate tool for the rising gen. Be just a little bit curious and give your parents an inch to tell you their story. And maybe you have heard their story over and over and maybe you don't want to hear it anymore, but if you want to be led in, be curious.
So where do you think the industry is going? Because, we see more research around mental health and the human side of things and it relates to transition. Why do you think that's coming up now and not, say, 5, 7, 8, 10 years ago? What's that about?
It's about the rising gen. The rising gen cares about those things. The rising gen wants to have a healthy relationship with financial capital. The rising generation wants to have a life that is built on purpose and is focused on doing good, whatever that means. And so the industry is trying to get ahead of this by developing products, by developing services that will ultimately attract the rising generation to them. So I think that's what it is. I don't think we've reached this altruistic stage. I think the industry is trying to figure out what is the hook that will interest the rising generation to come to my bank or to come to my financial practice or whatever it may be.
Financial capital.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you see the rising gen dealing with advisors moving forward?
Well, okay, I'm going to give you a litmus test for the rising gen. For you rising gens, I want you to look at the firms that your parents work with and I want you to look at their marketing material. Does their marketing material speak to you? Or does their marketing material talk about you? Most financial services firms are writing about the rising generation, not writing to the rising generation. So there will be firms that will hear this podcast and will figure it out and say, oh, if we create marketing materials that actually speaks directly to the rising generation, not to the parents about what the rising generation thinks, but someone's going to figure this out in a big way, and the rising generation will know that that firm or those firms were developed for them, not as an afterthought, not as a, how do we just keep these assets here, but a firm that is going to cater to the things that are interesting, important, and aligned with the rising generation. And those firms will win in a big way.
So if you are an advisor, pay attention to this one because, Dave, you're absolutely right.
Tell me one. Honestly, tell me one. Tell me a firm that is doing a good job of speaking to them. All firms are speaking about the rising generation. I don't know many that are speaking to them.
It's a good point. It's a really great point. And I think it's because they don't really understand them and know them. They firms put them in a bucket as a way to maintain assets, as opposed to really understanding who they are, what matters to them, what are their wants, what are their fears, and what do they really want to do. Because the rising gen, frankly, this is going to be a bold statement, don't really care about the financial capital. They're more interested in what it can do. Not for them, but for the globe and for others.
Well, you look at just the construction of these financial teams at these firms. Is there anyone in the rising generation that is tasked with just understanding and serving the needs and the intentions of the rising generation? Many times this is an afterthought. It's built to hold on to the assets for another 10 years. But those teams, again, that get constructed with individuals from the generation that they will serve, I think they'll win because those advisors, the team will be built to serve them intentionally, not as an afterthought. And it will attract the rising generation that wants to work with their peers and wants to work with someone that is going to be there when they need them. And you can't work with someone that's 30 years older than you and assume that's going to be your team forever. So the construction of the teams that serve these families needs to look like the families they serve.
Yeah. So you bring up some really great points, and you and I are so aligned in so many places. So what's one piece of advice you can offer the senior generation and the rising generation based on your perspective, knowledge, and experience?
You're on the same team. I wish we would just decide that you're on the same team and that the things that you want, you need to discover and talk about. And don't let people divide you. I think if we just decided we're on the same team, then the outcomes, the structures that were developed, and the complexities that are introduced can actually serve the family unit. And here's the thing, the advisor community needs to shift from serving a wealth creator to serving a family unit. And until the community decides that they're going to build tools to serve mothers, to serve fathers, to serve the rising generation, there's going to continue to be this money in motion because families are not being served. So any advisors that are listening to this, if you're not developing your team to serve a family unit and you're still focused on the wealth creator, prepare to have money go elsewhere.
Yeah, you will become extinct very quickly. There's talk about this massive wealth transfer, and it'll be exiting. those groups for sure, without a doubt. So, Dave, great conversation. Great to have you on the show. So, if people want to learn more about you and find you and talk to you in greater depth, how do they find you?
Well, you can easily Google Dave Specht, Specht. I've written a couple books, the Family Business Whisperer, or if there's any farm kids on this call, it's the Farm Whisperer is the second book. I have a couple of different master classes coming out, the Family Business Masterclass with Dennis Jaffe, and then also the Generational Wealth class, the Generational Wealth Masterclass with Jay Hughes. The rising generation is going to love that content because it was built for them.
That's wonderful. So, Dave, thank you so much for being on the show. Great conversation, and thanks for your generosity and your thoughts. They're definitely in alignment with how we operate and what we think. So, thank you so much. And folks, as you know, our guests volunteer their time, their wisdom, and their knowledge for you. So, share, your thoughts. Share the show with those that you care about and those that are in a similar situation as you, because as we all know, it's a lonely place being part of the system. And you all think that you're really unique and alone, and you're not. You're part of the system. You all got the same issues and challenges. So please share the show and reach out to Dave if you have any questions and would like to learn more. Dave, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.